Welcome to Polaris Live. This is Sarwar Kashmiri welcoming our viewers from around the world to this series of programs on the United States and China in the world. This program is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. I'd like to remind our viewers that you can ask questions throughout the program using the comment button on the right-hand side of the screen. Time permitting, we will get to as many of your questions as we possibly can. My guest today is Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, the United States. She's the author of Shaping the Future of Power, Knowledge Production and Network Building in China-Africa Relations. Her current book project examines China's multilateral foreign policy in continental Africa. She's a prolific writer and has been featured and or quoted in Foreign Policy, Washington Post, Aljazeera, The Guardian, Le Monde, The Economist, the BBC. In addition to her scholarly research and teaching, she aims to bridge the gap between academic scholarship and public-facing and foreign policy-making outlets. Please welcome Dr. Lina Benabdallah. Good morning, Professor Abdullah. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's such a pleasure to be with you.
Well, it's an honor for us to have you. You're one of the most astute observers of the China-US-Africa triangle, something that we should be exploring much more on Polaris Live. So thank you for coming. I'm going to ask you to begin with Russia's indiscriminate shelling of civilians in Ukraine resulted in over 5 million refugees fleeing to European Union countries, which have welcomed them with open arms. But Russia's equally indiscriminate shelling of civilians in Syria also has resulted in 5 million refugees who met a different reception. They were fenced out of the European Union. Why this differing response? Your thoughts?
Yeah, I'd like to refer to something that Fanon wrote about in The Wretched of the Earth, where he described what he called the Manichaean world, in which you see very much a very similar context, the same place, the same, but the treatment of, in his description, the treatment of Algerians who were under colonial regime, so that the definition of what it meant to be an Algerian person, even the humanity that was ascribed to the Algerians during colonial times was very, very different from the same kind of humanity ascribed to their French counterparts, to same situation, same city, same places, but people are treated differently. So he describes this as sort of this Manichaean world where you really have these opposites that live side by side, but somehow the rules of humanity and dignity and citizenship and rights just don't apply to those indigenous people who are living in Algeria during colonial times. That Manichaean world description that Fanon talks about can very much help us see also this question of why would some, refugees, as you were describing, out of Syria, for instance, just don't get the same kind of, compassion or solidarity or the same kind of reporting from the media that we get, for instance, when we're describing other crises, and especially the one that we see now in Ukraine, which has been described more or less as sort of as this kind of European in-house kind of one member of the family kind of crisis, as opposed to the other, so this kind of fenced out other that does not get the same kind of treatment in terms of what it means to be human, what it means to be kind of living a dignified life.
Indeed. I want to switch to Africa, but a quick follow-up to what you've just said. The US and the EU, Dr. Benabdallah, are the world's self-proclaimed leaders of democracy and humanitarian concerns. Do you think this differing behavior that we are seeing unroll in front of our eyes will scar their image?
I think it most certainly has. It has done a couple of things. It has basically exposed, it had made visible
Right.
what it means to be part of the group and what it means to be an outsider. And it has also really created cracks. It has created cracks in thinking about what it means to live in a world with U.S. hegemony. What does it mean to live in a world where a kind of a moment where you have one superpower that's left unchallenged, and what it means to have powers challenge in the U.S. And so and that has created an interesting conversation, an interesting observation, where you see a lot of countries in the global south, for instance, they're not necessarily voting pro-Russia or pro-China, but a lot of them are actually voting against U.S. hegemony. That's kind of a unipolar world order that is scary to a lot of global south countries that see, for instance, going out on a mission to sort of put the world on this kind of binary. Again, you're kind of on the team of the US, Western Europe, and so on and so forth, or you're against, and that has actually created some resistance and challenge movement among global south states that, even if they're not necessarily they're not happy with what Russia is doing, they're not backing Russia in its invasion of Ukraine, they're also not comfortable with leaving the US kind of to its hegemonic behavior.
So you almost seem to be arguing, if I may use the word, that a bipolar or a multipolar leadership world would be better.
I mean, I think from the perspective of global south states that don't see themselves as being treated as an equal, when you have refugees coming from global south states that do not attract as much attention, as much solidarity, as much kind of rhetoric of standing in solidarity, then that it pushes, it causes people to ask those questions. And so this world order is not made to treat us as equals. And so that actually creates the situation where, from the perspective of a lot of global south states, it makes more sense to have some sort of challenge and resistance to a US to the US hegemony that does not necessarily recognize them as equals.
Let me switch to Africa. Right, you've researched and written extensively about China's projects in Africa under the Belt and Road Initiative. And as you've put it, China isn't just building bridges and roads, it's making friends. Trade between the continent of Africa and China has mushroomed. America seems to be missing the boat on this huge continent. You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it is quite interesting to observe that the trends over the last, let's say, 20 years, where you see an increasing trend in terms of China-Africa relations, whether it's trade volumes, whether it's consultation meetings, numbers of students, joining Chinese university or universities in China. You see the trend is going up. It's an increasing trend. On the other hand, when you look at US-Africa relations, it almost seems like it has kind of been stuck in a post-9/11 kind of moment, where US views Africa more or less from a very narrow-minded perspective, which remained focused on that sort of military, counterterrorism, that sort of allyship in the US's war on terror. And that has not trickled down enough or fast enough in other sectors, including trade or diplomatic relations or cultural relations, and so on and so forth.
Well, that's interesting what you've just said, because it just brought to mind, a couple of headlines, Dr. Benabdallah. First of all, a headline I read in the South China Morning Post just a few days ago, which talked about China's trade with Africa since the beginning of this year is almost more than the entire trade from last year. Right. And then another headline from just yesterday, which is America will now restart sending soldiers to Somalia. And I was just thinking of what you've just said, and that is an illustration of the constricted security only type of view that American policymakers seem to be taking Ray Africa. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that contrast you just described is just huge, right? The contrast is showing how China is interested in developing its relationship, and it sees in Africa and African countries partners in terms of investment, in terms of trade, in terms of creating projects that have the potential to increase, grow economies here in Africa, provide jobs, and so on and so forth. Whereas for the U.S., as you described, it's sort of the situation of sending, more troops to Somalia and having basically U.S. AFRICOM conduct a lot of U.S. presence in the continent really gives very separate images, right? It just gives a very separate image to the U.S. in terms of perception.
Yes.
Of African people, citizens, and in surveys that compared to how they perceive China as more or less a holistic kind of partner these days, because whereas China in the last 20 years kind of focused mostly on trade and investments, we have seen in the last 2 to 3 years an interest also in partnering in terms of security as well. So China is no longer kind of just this kind of development, that idea 10 years ago, for instance, in scholarship, people were floating around the idea that there's almost kind of a division of labor where the US takes on kind of security, military relations with Africa, and then you have China taking on kind of a commercial, more kind of trade-oriented, investment-oriented relationship in Africa. And that is a little bit more blurry now, right? That division of labor does not necessarily hold, because you see China being now interested in sort of being this kind of, more rounded, more holistic kind of partner of African countries, including in security, in the security realm as well.
Well, the reason this business of not doing enough trade with Africa or thinking of it outside the security lens surprises me is because, the business of America, some famous person once said, is business, right? The business of America is business. And I recall reading somewhere that in another 2 decades, Nigeria alone will have a larger consumer population than America does. So it really is short-sighted. And I'm drilling down a little more to ask you some more about what you've thought about this.
Mm-hmm.
The US is the country that has the largest university educated population. Are we just missing something here? How can this be?
Yeah, I will refer you also. So a couple of weeks ago, Eric Olander from the China-Africa Project made an observation that then later on Cobus van Staden published in a piece. And in the observation, Eric says, kind of really mind-blowing how he said U.S.-Africa trade in all of 2021 was smaller than China-Africa trade volume in the first quarter of 2022. So up to just a couple of months within 2022, China-Africa trade volume was bigger than U.S.-Africa trade volume in the whole year of 2021. That just gives you a little bit of perspective. I mean, it's a huge difference, and that just shows where China's priorities are, where the relationship between China and Africa has kind of really expanded. But it also shows that there is something very profitable, right? So this is not aid, this is not charity, this is kind of trade volumes that show time and time again now, all kinds of studies show that in terms of population, African continent is going to have kind of the biggest trends in the world in terms of urbanization. And when you talk about urbanization, you talk about the need for cities to accommodate in terms of infrastructure, accommodate in terms of all kinds of services. And that means building, right? So you need that infrastructure, the housing, the roads, all of the utilities that are going to accommodate more kind of urbanization trend that we're following and we're seeing already in the African continent, and it's going to continue. And so here you have these possibilities for Chinese companies to kind of bank on some of these projects and conduct some of these constructions. On top of that, there's also trends that show some of the fastest growing economies in the world right now are in the African continent. And a fast growing economy also leads to a larger middle class. And when you have larger middle class, it means you have bigger purchasing power. It means that there are some products that are going to be purchased and needed and kind of, imported to these countries for the consumption of these ever-growing kind of middle class. And so that's also where China has been banking on these needs and trying to be providing some of these products that this bigger and newer kind of middle class in African countries have been. So you see a lot of opportunities that Chinese companies have been, banking on in Africa. But then you also see Chinese companies also really building products that are made specifically for the African market. So you see here kind of catering to the African market, which is very creative, it's very innovative, and it's also very unique to sort of Chinese companies that will, for instance, I'm talking about like phone companies, right? So phone making companies, where they would make like Oppo, for instance, or Techno or Huawei, where you see them actually producing phones that have characteristics that were surveyed in African markets, where they would ask people. So, for instance, this idea of dual SIM, this idea of specific qualities in the cameras, specific characteristics, then they take those kind of needs analysis, they go to the manufacturer and they produce phones and products that are catered for the African consumer. And that's huge, right? So that's not something that we have seen US companies do. Actually, US companies, I don't think that they actually have the African consumer in mind. When you think about Apple, for instance, those are extremely expensive, top of the line phones that are not going to be necessarily kind of afforded by kind of, everywhere, especially not in the global South and not in African countries. So there are some fundamental differences with the way that Chinese companies go about kind of making, their impact and their inroads into the African markets.
Well, it's fascinating you said that, and I have noticed the same thing whenever I travel to Mexico, that there are fewer iPhones and they seem to latch on more to Chinese cell phones where they've studied the market and done that. But let me ask you a question, which a lot of people are asking these days. China has, at this point anyway, maybe 1.5, 2 military bases around the world. The US has 600 last time I checked. Do you think that there is something that has happened after 9/11 which gives America a terrible fright, rape, terrorism and terrorists? Here we've put in these soldiers into Somalia because Al-Shabaab, which is connected to other terrorists, seems to be gaining ground there. My question to you is this. Why isn't any other country, seemingly, especially China, as afraid of the terrorism that seems to be coming out of Africa from the American viewpoint? Why is America almost alone in thinking that they're so threatened? We are so threatened by terrorism. It's a difficult question, but I'd love for you to address it.
Yeah, there's a simple way of addressing it, which is to think about it from an economic perspective. Economically speaking, it's really costly to run all these bases, right? It's really costly. It's just cost the US a lot of money to play this role. And, and when you are kind of a rising power, even if, and I'm not saying that it is the case, but I'm saying even if sort of this threat of kind of security is globally experienced, why would a rising power invest in something as costly as playing sort of this big kind of, huge military role globally when somebody else is, right? So it's a huge bill. It's a really big bill. And why? So it doesn't, from the perspective of that kind of the cost, a benefit of it, it just seems like a no-brainer to not necessarily challenge the US in this role and just let it play it, unilaterally and do it globally in that way, the way it is doing it. So why would, but at the same time, this doesn't mean that, for instance, China is not trying to increase its impact or footprint in terms of security relations, albeit differently, right? So not necessarily through bases, not necessarily going to be, building 600 bases around the world, but it's still trying to build relations, at least, at the very least, kind of have strong connections, strong relations, military to military, kind of that soft diplomacy within the military realm with a lot of Pacific islands, with a lot of Indian Ocean islands, with a lot of countries here and there along sort of the Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of them in the African continent as well. So there are other ways that China is trying to be present in terms of military and security arena, but it just doesn't make sense to kind of compete or outcompete the US in this way of building all these like military bases, which are extremely costly. And so, there's a logical explanation there in a way. If a country is up to foot in the bill for that, then it seems as a no-brainer not to be involved. But at the same time, for instance, the US is not necessarily this approach, right? So this militarized approach of the US globally has not showed a very successful results just yet. So from the example of Afghanistan, sort of that kind of state building through that interventionism, the example of Iraq, the example of others, they don't leave appetite, right, for other countries to kind of emulate that example. I mean, it's just, well, right now what France is living in Mali, for instance, is very kind of parallel and similar and reminding of what the US has been experiencing in Afghanistan and in Iraq. It's not an example that a rising power is going to look up to, right? It's creating a lot of animosity. It's creating a lot of challenge by people. Perceptions in those countries is very low. There's these absolute nightmare kind of reputation disadvantages to this role that a rising power does not necessarily want to fill those shoes anytime soon.
Which leads me to a related question, which is, you are an authority on the Belt and Road Initiative, and the projects in Africa. And do you think that in time, this will change to a more military direction? Because right now it's all civilian projects, and it's win-win from a business perspective, and we have a very interesting question that's come up, which from a viewer, which I'll ask you in a second. But what do you think? Do you think China will naturally transition as the West has earlier in its day?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to tell because it's always difficult to kind of really predict in terms of long-term horizons. But what we have seen so far does not suggest that we are going to see kind of a US 2.0 in China and China's presence in Africa in the future. There are lots of reasons for it. But what we have already seen shows us that there's fatigue in the African continent when it comes to foreign interventionism. There is a lot of already kind of skepticism. There's a lot of challenge and resistance. You see protests this week in Mali, anti-France protests. People are just not, open to these kind of military relations. In fact, that's why China is kind of a breath of fresh air for a lot of Africans. It's just because its approach is just different. It's just that's not interested in seeing Africans as a place where you can just have a drone base or some intervention, but actually it's kind of this other approach to the relationship, which is more development oriented, commercial, and so on and so forth, that are really interesting to people. So I think from China's perspective, there's absolutely an acknowledgement that this is the way Africans perceive the difference between China and kind of Western powers in Africa, is that China is not interventionist. So from what we have seen already, we don't think that there is strong evidence for predicting that there will be kind of a US 2.0 in Africa from
Okay.
China.
It's
But then again, of course, it's kind of an educated kind of prediction based on what we have already seen.
Sure. So here's a question that I've picked one from our viewers. And this person asks, how do you account for China's treatment of their Muslim Uyghurs while trading with Muslim countries in Africa?
Yeah, and it's a huge paradox, and it's the paradox that doesn't just exist in China-Africa relations, but I mean, in 2019, in July, we recall that there was a letter signed by a lot of countries, among whom were 9 Middle East and North African countries that were supporting China's treatment of or China's policy in Xinjiang to the UN Human Rights Council.
Yes.
And and it's hugely kind of paradoxical in that way, where you'd be wondering, so how is it that the governments of these countries kind of are supporting and backing China in its policy in Xinjiang? It's a very complex issue. How do we make sense of it is a very good question. It's a very complex question. But from the perspective of governments, that's the idea is that they, there's a lot of this kind of professed kind of non-interference, wherever there is a kind of a domestic issue, then you have kind of this kind of the sovereignty principle or this non-interference principle come back, where you have this government saying, well, actually, what China is doing within China's borders is China's right to do, and the same way around. So you have then China, Beijing is backing, all kinds of all governments essentially. It just does not interfere with what's going on in Ethiopia. It's not calling out the government for what's going on in for instance, with in the case of Ethiopia. And what in Tigray region, so what that tells us is a sort of these government to government relations, right? So they don't necessarily describe how people at the level of society, for instance, feel about these things, right? So you have a lot more kind of outcry if you watch, for instance, social media spaces, or if you're following like civil society organizations. They will have a lot more to say, for instance, about what China is doing in Xinjiang or what Ethiopian government is doing in Tigray than each of these governments say about one another. So in that way, I think at some point it's probably more helpful to kind of disaggregate that sort of state to state, government to government kind of level of the relations versus kind of the people perception level of it.
Okay, it's as we come to the time that we have, I do want to ask you one more question. I want to end, Dr. Benabdallah, on a positive note. And I want to ask you, is there a project, do you think, in Africa that America and China can work together to begin cooling the daggers drawn posture between the two countries right now, right? And I'm thinking maybe COVID vaccinations, maybe something along those lines of a pandemic, or even pollution control. I'm trying to think of a project, and you, with your background, I thought might be ideally suited to suggest one to the wise people who sit up on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, I mean, we could spend another half hour or even more on this kind of US-China rivalry and what it means for Africa and how it's felt and how it's perceived in the African continent. But in many ways, I think that the China-Africa, the kind of the US-China kind of animosity, rivalry, whatever you want to call it, difficult times, turbulence, needs to be fixed first in China and the US, and then kind of trickles down in other places. But should that happen in Africa, I think what you described is extremely on point. In terms of public health, there's a lot of opportunity to collaborate in terms of environment. So projects that are sort of green finance, green investments is another area where you could have US kind of providing more or less kind of kind of a soft investment where you have the capital and you have the investments and kind of the infrastructure projects coming from Chinese companies. So we can actually merge the two. In tech industry, for instance, as I was mentioning earlier, kind of this urbanization trend in Africa, there's also a trend for young people more and more kind of needing and using the internet, getting, startups. The numbers of startups in the African continent are growing tremendously. And so that needs a digital infrastructure of its own. And we've seen it through the pandemic, how digital infrastructure is extremely important and also very, very needy and needed in the African continent. So there's another area where you could see kind of places for collaboration. Another place would just be kind of capacity building, which is to say kind of providing trainings for young people in terms of different managerial, kind of positions, roles. And so providing capacity would also be super helpful, and a place where it's kind of low stake, low key for, potential collaboration. So, I mean, there are technically and theoretically speaking, there are a lot of places and ideas and projects that can actually be kind of trilateral, where you see a US company and a Chinese company working in an African country to build or to produce kind of a project. But at the same time, we're not in that reality, in that space right now. In fact, what we see right now is quite the opposite. Is kind of really crowding the same space or doing the same thing and outdoing one another, or sort of, not necessarily kind of combining where, both together would be best for the African recipient or participant. But in a way, we're quite far really from seeing kind of a trilateral project taking wings in an African country right now.
Well, this has been such a fascinating discussion, Dr. Lina Benabdallah. I want to thank you again for coming on Polaris Live, and I hope you'll take the time to do that again. But thank you so very, very much for this discussion.
Absolutely. This was a pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation. I love chatting with you.
Well, listen, same here. And at this point, let me thank our viewers from around the world. Please join us again for the next episode of Polaris Live as we continue to discuss United States and China and the world. Until then, goodbye.